Tonight, I'm going to be talking about Ian McEwan's lessons and about my bibliotherapy session with Ian McEwan, which was at the London Library on Thursday night. Rather thrillingly, I had the great delight of interviewing the man himself and doing an under the covers session with him, which is when I put an author or other interesting person under the covers, asking them all about their life in books and getting them to tell the audience about what they read as a child, what they read as a teenager, what they read as an adult, what they turn to for inspiration when they're doing their own writing. So I was talking to Ian about his latest book and then about his life in books. So I'm going to do a bit tonight about the book, Lessons, which you might have read. Let me know if you have read it. I'd love to know your thoughts. And then I'm going to be talking a bit about the bibliotherapy side of things and what Ian revealed about his life, and also what I prescribed for him for his various ailments. So, Lessons is a book which is about many themes. It takes the life of a young boy, Roland Baines, who goes to school in a boarding school in Norfolk when he's about 11. And it's very much an autobiographical novel. There are various things that happen which are definitely not autobiographical. And when I asked Ian McEwan where the seed of the book came from to get him going down the journey of writing it, he said that he started thinking about all the really key events of his own life in history and where he was at the times that they happened, and then putting into context what he was thinking, doing, um, where he was at his stage of life at the time. And that's how he started to get into the context of writing this book. So, in this book, there are a lot of really key events, including the fall of the Berlin Wall and lockdown, and many other big events, because it goes back to the 1950s. And Ian McEwan wanted to have those major world events shown alongside the events of his own life, or in fact, the events of Roland Baines's life, the boy in this book. So um, that is a really interesting revelation, because when I read the book, I didn't think that that was going to be where the book was engendered. I thought that it was all about the fact that Roland is abused by his piano teacher, because that does begin quite early in the novel. We know that there's this interestingly abusive power relationship going on between a teacher, piano teacher, and a young boy. And the teacher first meets Roland when he's only 11, and she already starts to groom him for a sexual relationship. I mean, we realise that she is not deliberately grooming him for this sexual relationship when we put it into the context of the whole book later, but it does seem to be that way when you first read the book. And it's a pretty shocking moment when Miriam, who's the piano teacher, actually pinches Roland's leg and kisses him on the mouth when he's played a particularly good piece. So there's a lot of shocking intimacy in this novel, which is something that we do come to expect in the novels of Ian McEwan. In The Cement Garden, for instance, one of his earliest novels, there is incest and a lot of surprising intimacy between siblings. In On Chesil Beach, there's the really terrible sexual repression of two people, which culminates in a really shocking moment, which I find one of the most harrowing scenes in the whole of literature. So we know that Ian McEwan doesn't shy away from moments of extremity, and particularly sexual extremity. And we do get quite a lot of those in this book. So, one of the major themes in Lessons is the abusive power relationship between a piano teacher and her pupil. It's quite unusual to have an older predatory woman and a younger innocent boy. Of course, the boy, Roland, feels very much complicit in what happens in the relationship. He actually believes that he's the one that started it because he cycles to um, his teacher's house thinking that the world's about to end because there's various massive world events going on at the time, and the campaign for nuclear disarmament is taking place. And Roland thinks that he might die without ever getting it, in other words, without ever having sex. And so that's why he cycles to his piano teacher's house when he's 14, 3 years after she first invited him round. And he then has sex with her, and he feels like this was actually his own doing and it was all his own idea, whereas in fact it was clearly Miriam, the piano teacher, who made it happen. And we do get a little bit of the piano teacher's perspective. We never actually hear it from her own voice, but Ian McEwan, I think, writes cleverly enough for us to feel like we see inside her head and understand what's going on. And we kind of empathize with her a bit in the same way that when you read Lolita, you get into Humbert's head, you understand what he's thinking. Not that we forgive it at all, but we fully comprehend what's going on. And it is a very complicated and complex scenario. Anyway, so that's one of the major themes. And then the uh, the rest of the book, which does go back and forth describing what happened between Roland and his teacher, Miriam, shows how the rest of his life was affected by this abusive relationship. And one of the terrible things I think about it is that Roland was actually an absolutely brilliant pianist. He was a bit of a prodigy, but because Miriam abuses him and actually, spoiler alert, wants to marry him when he's 16, that's when he suddenly realizes this is really bizarre. She's 25 or so. He's just about to turn 16, and she buys them both a ticket to go to Gretna Green and get married. And she reveals her complete obsession at that point with Roland. And he actually understands that he's got to get out of this situation and runs away. But that does mean that he completely jeopardizes his piano career when he really was potentially set to be an amazing concert pianist, which is really sad. However, he does go on to have a rich and varied life. And the question is, what are the lessons that he learns? Does he learn lessons from Miriam, his piano teacher? Does he learn lessons from his own wife later on, who he marries? And there are various other lessons that come into the book. And the very end of the book, he's asking what questions he's learned, what lessons he's learned, which I won't give you spoilers too much. Do anyone that hasn't fully read it, there might be a few spoilers. So um, don't watch if you're right in the middle of reading it and you don't want to know what happens. So one of the other big themes in the book is the theme of resistance to political events and the theme of feeling trapped by uh, history. And Roland actually muses about the past and about the fact that he is born in a really good era, which means that he's not going to be shot by the Nazis, for instance. And I'll just read you a little extract from the book. Roland reflects: the past, the modern past, was a weight, a burden of piled rubble, forgotten grief. But the weight on him was at one remove. It barely weighed at all. The accidental fortune was beyond calculation. To have been born in 1948 in placid Hampshire, not Ukraine or Poland in 1928, not to have been dragged from the synagogue steps in 1941 and brought here. His white tiled cell, a piano lesson, a premature love affair, a missed education, a missing wife, was by comparison a luxury suite. If his life so far was a failure, as he often thought, it was in the face of history's largesse, which I think is a really great idea. The fact that Roland is born in the lap of history's largesse and he is able to live a full and happy life, even though his life is possibly ruined quite early on by his piano teacher. And his wife, Alyssa, actually leaves him. So, this is another really major theme in order to fulfill her artistic dreams. So, that is a really massive and interesting theme, which is all about whether you can be an artist, be a writer, be a completely committed, creative person while being married. Uh, I'm sure that many of you creative types out there might have fantasized about leaving your partner in order to write your novel or create your masterpieces. You might imagine that the only way to really get on with a creative project is to live completely on your own and get on with your own life and completely dedicate yourself to creativity. And this is what Roland's wife actually does, shockingly. So they have a baby, Lawrence, and when he's still only one, so he's still a toddler and only just beginning to eat solid foods, she leaves a note on the kitchen table saying, sorry, I'm living the wrong life. And she leaves. She leaves the baby with her husband and off she goes. And for some time, Roland doesn't know why she's left or what is going on, but it slowly becomes apparent that she left because um, she wants to dedicate herself to writing. And the fascinating thing about this situation that we see unfolding before us is that she does indeed become an amazing and brilliant writer, almost winning the Nobel Prize, but not quite. And Roland forgives her for leaving him because she's such an amazing writer. And he does make the point that he forgives her because she's so brilliant, but he would not have forgiven her if she'd been a mediocre writer. So that's an interesting thought as well. Do you forgive an artist for the terrible things that they do because they are brilliant? Or do you not? Can you separate the life from the art? So these are all questions that are being asked in Ian McEwan's lessons. One of the other big themes in the book, which I was just mentioning, is the idea of political resistance. And the White Rose movement, which was in Germany in 1943, is quite a big part of the plot at the beginning of the book because Roland's wife's mother was reporting on the White Rose movement, and Roland's wife's father was also slightly involved in the White Rose movement. So, for people that don't know about the White Rose movement, which I didn't, it is actually a really interesting part of Nazi Germany, which I had in my ignorance not been aware of. So there was a brother and sister, Sophie Scholl and her brother Hans, who attempted to resist the Nazi movement. They actually grew up as part of Hitler's youth, and they were initially enthusiastic members of the Nazi Party. But as they grew into their teens, they slowly realised what was going on with the Nazis and how evil they were. And so they started to create leaflets which they distributed all about the evils of the Nazi regime. And they gave very clear advice and advocated sabotage of Hitler's war machine. So they were a pretty amazing brother and sister, Sophie Scholl and Hans Scholl of the White Rose movement. And they completely took their convictions to the very end, because they were actually sentenced to death by the Nazis and indeed guillotined for their beliefs. So they said, they had some really fantastic uh, sayings in their leaflets. They said, in their fifth pamphlet, they did six in all, and the seventh was in their bags when they were arrested. And now every convinced opponent of National Socialism must ask himself how he can fight against the present state in the most effective way. We cannot provide each man with a blueprint for his acts. We can only suggest them in general terms, and he alone will find the way of achieving this end. Sabotage in armament plants and war industries, sabotage at all gatherings, rallies, public ceremonies, and organisations of the Nationalist Socialist Party, obstruction of the smooth functioning of the war machine. Try to convince all your acquaintances of the senselessness of continuing, of the hopelessness of this war, of our spiritual and economic enslavement at the hands of the National Socialists, of the destruction of all moral and religious values, and urge them to passive resistance. So this is for people joining now, the White Rose movement, which is something that Ian McEwan goes into quite a big digression on in this novel, because one of the characters was doing a report on it, 30 years later. And it's a really fascinating story, which I'm really glad that I discovered and didn't know about before. There's another really great section that I'm just going to read to you from one of the pamphlets of the White Rose movement, written by Sophie Scholl and her brother, who were ultimately executed for their staunch commitment to not letting the Nazis take over. She said, even the most dull-witted German has had his eyes opened by the terrible bloodbath which, in the name of the freedom and honour of the German nation, they have unleashed upon Europe, and unleash anew each day. The German name will remain forever tarnished, unless finally the German youth stands up, pursues both revenge and atonement, smites our tormentors, and founds a new intellectual Europe. Students, the German people look to us. The responsibility is ours, just as the power of the spirit broke the Napoleonic terror in 1813, so too will it break the terror of the National Socialists in 1943. So this is Hans and Sophie Scholl of the White Rose movement, who were distributing leaflets as much as they possibly could, but they were arrested when Sophie dropped a whole bag of leaflets over a a barrier in the town where they lived, and they were taken to court, and there was a kind of puppet court that put them through a mockery of a trial, her and her brother, and then they were guillotined, only age I think 19 and 20. It's a really horrific story, but it's also a really inspiring one, because Sophie and her brother completely stood up for what they believed in and had the courage of their convictions to keep strong to the end. And Ian McEwan writes about this very movingly in this book. It comes quite near the beginning. Lovely to see lots of people joining. Antoine, lovely to see you here. And while you're here, I did want to mention that I'm excited that we're going to be doing a session in the near future about this book and all your other books as well. maybe we haven't quite committed to a date yet, but it's going to be probably early March, to be continued. So thanks for joining us this evening. And Antoine, let's liaise later about finalising a date. So getting back to Ian McEwan and lessons, the major themes which I've been mentioning are uh, art versus family. So that's personified by Alyssa, who is the wife of Roland, who's the hero of the book. And Alyssa actually does leave her husband in order to go and write a novel. And she becomes completely dedicated to her novel writing and becomes a very successful novel writer. Do you have to leave your family in order to write novels? I ask you. Antoine, we could talk about that in our session as well. Obviously, Ian McEwan didn't leave his wife in order to write his novels, so I suspect he doesn't believe that. But it is an interesting thought. Is it very difficult to actually live an ordinary family life and be creative at the same time? So that's one of the themes of the book. Then there's also the theme of the abusive relationship, the piano teacher with the young boy, and the way that that power struggle between the boy and his piano teacher completely takes over his whole life and in a way adjusts the course of his life. And it is a book which reminded me of another book slightly with a similar theme, which is Patrick Gale's really lovely book, Take Nothing With You, in which uh, we delve into the life of a man who is an amazing cello player. And he was actually a bit of a prodigy when he was young, very much like Roland is in this book at the beginning. But he doesn't quite make the grade. He's not quite good enough to go and be a concert cellist. And I love the way Patrick Gale describes the effect on the boy's life of wanting to be an amazing cellist, thinking that he can do that, and then slowly realizing that actually it's not quite going to work. It's such a tragedy. And with this book, Roland is actually probably good enough to be a concert pianist, but he doesn't uh, he doesn't fulfill this because his life is completely screwed up by his own piano teacher. Ironically, she's the person that discovers his brilliance and completely champions him. But then she's so obsessed with him that she ruins his life, tries to marry him. And one of the great, hilarious scenes in this book, I mean, hilarious in a dark, typical Ian McEwan way, is that she actually locks all of Roland's clothes and possessions in a trunk in her garden shed, and she only lets him wear pajamas. She buys him yellow and blue pajamas. It's actually really sinister because she's keeping him trapped in her own house, not telling his school where he is, or because she's obsessed with him and she wants him to live with her forever. She is insane. However, it does make really good reading. And the book does kind of ramble on a bit, it must be said. It's long, it's fat, but it is a great read. It's brilliantly written, and we fully enjoy being with Roland through all of his many different incarnations. And actually, one of the things I love about it too is that Roland, so he starts off being an amazing pianist. We think maybe that's what he'll do. But then he kind of gets jobs, manual labor jobs. He works doing very basic and kind of uh, heavy lifting roadman type jobs. But then he also does become a tinkling pianist in a hotel at one point. He's also a tennis coach. he also writes poetry for a kind of poetry card company. So he does all these different random jobs, which many of us can also relate to. Many of us um, who have a portfolio career are used to doing lots of different things. And there aren't that many people in life who just do one job, let's face it. So that's one of the things that I really like about the book, is that it's all very real. You believe in Roland, you believe in his rather complex and rather messy life. So his wife leaves him in order to become a writer. She becomes highly successful and brilliant. He forgives her for this because she's so brilliant. And then he meets another woman, Daphne, who he does love and falls in love with, but she is still, hi Harper in Paris, great to see you there. She is still kind of attached to her ex, Peter, and so this love is not very simple at all. And then there's a really fantastic scene right towards the end of the novel when Roland and Peter are both fighting over the ashes of Daphne, who is Roland's girlfriend, and Daphne was married to Peter. And they both want to scatter the ashes of Daphne in the place where she asked to be scattered, in the Lake District. And they're literally wrestling with this urn, ready to scatter it. And it's actually totally hilarious. Harper, you've just been to the Eiffel Tower. That's great news. I hope it was fantastic. We also have a French author, Antoine Laurent, on this uh, podcast, dare I call it such a thing, that we're doing right now, this Instagram Live. So Antoine, my daughter Harper, is in Paris right now, seeing the sights, which is fantastic, with her school. Sorry to digress. And Harper, this is Antoine's book, which you should read when you get back. Whoops, throwing it around in my excitement. Um, so, getting back to Ian McEwan, I am now going to talk about things that came up in our discussion, the bibliotherapy side of things, when I was talking to him on Thursday night in the London Library, which was a very great occasion with a very lovely audience. Sad that we couldn't record it, but maybe, you never know, I might get to interview him again one day. That would be great. So, when I asked Ian McEwan what he read as a child, he did say that he used to read lots of adventure novels because he was actually brought up, like Roland in this book, in army camps in Africa, I think in Libya. So there are a lot of very close, similar autobiographical elements in lessons to Ian McEwan's life. So Ian McEwan was an army child, and he was brought up by his army parents, who I think were, one gets the feeling, quite stiff and distant, rather like Roland's parents in this book. And he was given lots of adventure novels like Biggles. We bonded over Biggles because I used to read Biggles as well. And then he started reading Iris Murdoch very young. He read Under the Net, which he absolutely loved. And it's a book I haven't read for a long time, but Ian McEwan said that there were some very sexy scenes in that book, and maybe that might have been an early indication to Ian of the fact that he was going to write quite a lot of interesting sex in his novels, which he certainly does. Um, then we talked about the fact that Ian went to do the creative writing MA in what in UEA in Norwich, and Ian was telling a great story about how he he wanted to apply for this MA because he had some money from the government to do an MA. Who gets that these days? Lucky man. And he phoned UEA, University of East Anglia, and said, I'd like to speak to Malcolm Bradbury, please. And oh, poor connection. There we go. We're back. I'd like to speak to Malcolm Bradbury, please. Speaking, says Malcolm Bradbury. How often could you get Malcolm Bradbury on the phone nowadays? Probably never. And Ian McEwan said to Malcolm Bradbury, "Oh, I'd really like to come and do this MA course." Malcolm Bradbury said, "Sorry, the course is not going to happen because no one's actually applied for it." Ian McEwan said, "I want to apply for it," and joyously, Malcolm Bradbury then said, "Yes, great, come along, bring some pieces of writing for me, and we'll see if we can put you on the course." And Ian McEwan did exactly that. He quickly wrote a couple of stories because he hadn't actually written any yet, took them along, showed them to Malcolm Bradbury. Malcolm Bradbury thought they were fab, and the rest is history. And when I was asking him about if he learned a lot from doing the course at UEA, he basically said that he just got lots of encouragement from Malcolm Bradbury saying, "Oh, fantastic piece of writing, do another one, great, keep going." So he was just constantly encouraged. Great. And that's really how he started writing his own short stories. And uh, things progressed from there. So he was being very lovely and self-deprecating, saying that it's all a lot easier then. There were far fewer people in the world, far fewer people doing courses in creative writing, etc. But we also know that Ian McEwan is a fantastic writer. Um, so just quickly interjecting with a list of all the major events that happen during the course of this novel, because I meant to mention them earlier. We have the White Rose anti-Nazi group, which I've mentioned already. We have Chernobyl, which occurred in 1986, and that was one of the things that has a big effect on Roland's life in the book. Then there's the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And it was the Cuban Missile Crisis, that got young Roland cycling down a path to see his piano teacher, basically in order to go and have sex with her, because he thinks that he might be about to die because of the missile crisis, and therefore he must go and have sex immediately before he dies. So those are some of the major world events in the book, which is the reasons that Ian gave for actually writing the book in the first place. So to continue on the bibliotherapy side of things with Ian McEwan, he did mention some of his ailments, because part of what I do when I interview an author in an under the covers session is I ask the author what ailments they might have and what they're willing to share with the audience. And Ian McEwan did say that he has two not fully functioning knees. His knees are not in the best shape. So for that ailment, I prescribed to him a book that I'm trying to show you, but I don't know if it's going to appear to me at this moment, which is Zorba the Greek by Nikos Kazantzakis. Here we go, I've got it, which is a really great, brilliant read. It's actually a cure for many things, but I do think it's a great cure for having bad knees, because in this book, Zorba, the hero, dances through the pain. He dances through all sorts of situations. Whenever he's got a problem, he dances. And even though he's absolutely knackered and he hasn't slept for 36 hours, he still dances. So I was prescribing this to Ian McEwan for his bad knees, to encourage him to still be dancing, even though he might be in pain because of his knees. He also mentioned baldness as an issue, even though I think he's got a really good head of hair. He's 75 and he looks great, and his hair actually looks fab, but he obviously has a bit of an issue with his baldness. So I gave him our cures from the novel Cure for Baldness. We have two books which are good cures for baldness, and Ian McEwan enjoyed both of these, so I'll just read you those quickly. So one is Blowfly by Patricia Cornwell, and one is Sundog by Monique Ruffy. If you have a shiny pink pate on which nothing grows, and you catch glimpses of its outward spread reflected in windows as you pass, you may feel dismay at the passing of your locks, and perhaps with them a sense of virility. See Aging Horror of, for which our cure is jitterbug perfume, by the way. You envy the thick manes you see around you and wish that some of their excess could be transferred to you. But think of the evolution of man from ape to nearly hairless human. You are the superior being, your high-domed forehead more evolved. It is the mop-headed brutes who should feel shifty in your presence, and who would surely shave it all off if they had enough brains to think it through. If these sentiments don't reassure you, Patricia Cornwell's 17th novel, Blowfly, will. Jean-Baptiste Chandon was born with a fine down of black hair, not just on his head, but covering every inch of his body. As a child, he was treated as a worrying curiosity, hidden from the public by his embarrassed parents. As an adult, he has assumed the role of monster, a wolfman repellent to the eye, not merely because of his pelt, which is a word that one doesn't get to use very often, pelt, but because the condition brings with it a deformed body and a terrifyingly bestial face. Hair hangs around this novel, clogging sinks, coming out in tufts in people's hands, and left incriminatingly on dead bodies. Forensic science brings a magnifying lens to these hairs with medical examiner Kay Scarpetta, who I'm sure lots of you Cornwell fans might be familiar with, on the case. And in fact, she's met this hirsute beast before. As Scarpetta and Chandon sharpen their claws on one another's armoury, you'll be increasingly repelled by the sheer ickiness of all the hair, and will run your hand over your smooth scalp with untold relief. So this is one of those cures that works by kind of giving you the opposite. So showing someone who's incredibly hairy as an antidote for wanting hair yourself, because in this book, the hairy person is really repellent. And if you need further convincing that bald is best, read Monique Ruffy's Sundog. Her protagonist, August, is a man who can change his bodily attributes with the seasons. In the autumn, he has blood orange hair that leaps from his head as if from a burning attic. In winter, he turns blue and emits snowflakes. Wouldn't that be fun if you could actually do that? In spring, buds emerge from his armpits, nipples, and ears. And in summer, his hair comes off in swathes. It is then, at his baldest and most vulnerable, that August meets his true love. Luckily, she has no interest in whether he's tufty or smooth. She loves him for himself. So that's all about feeling better about being bald, basically. And Ian took those cures very happily. Then we've got a couple of other bibliotherapy ailments that Ian McEwan mentioned. Before going on to the heavy ones, I just wanted to read you what he put down in his questionnaire. So I asked him, where is it? Which subjects do you wish more authors would write about? He said, the difficult, conflicted, and dangerous times we live in now, the taste of cities, the impact of technology on private lives and loves, and on how we manage to live together in such vast numbers. So I thought that was really interesting. And if any of you have got any good ideas about books that tackle any of those issues, do let me know. But I did think I'd just read you a little bit from Ian McEwan's book, Saturday, which I also love, which I think really captures the taste of the city. And Ian McEwan asked for books which capture the taste of the city. One book I would definitely mention, oh, just noticing I've got a kind of white sperm of paint going across there. That's a bit shocking. Didn't know that was there. Very Ian McEwan, very on Chesil Beach. So I digress. Thinking about Taste of the City, one of my favourite books that I would prescribe him for that is The City and the City by China Mieville, which is an absolutely brilliant book. But apparently, Ian McEwan did say that he doesn't really read sci-fi or magic realism these days, although he did go through a big phase of reading it when he was in his teens. Anyway, a little bit from Saturday, which captures the taste of the city. Standing here, as immune to the cold as a marble statue, gazing towards Charlotte Street, towards the foreshortened jumble of facades, scaffolding, and pitched roofs, Henry thinks the city is a success, a brilliant invention, a biological masterpiece, millions teeming around the accumulated and layered achievements of the centuries, as though around a coral reef, sleeping, working, entertaining themselves, harmonious for the most part, nearly everyone wanting it to work. And the Perone's own corner, a triumph of congruent proportion, the perfect square laid out by Robert Adam, enclosing a perfect circle of garden. An 18th century dream, bathed and embraced by modernity, by streetlight from above, and from below by fibre optic cables, and cool fresh water coursing down pipes, and sewage borne away in an instant of forgetting. I just love the way he talks about the miracle of the way that we all live together there, as if we are a kind of hive of termites. Mixing metaphors there a bit. Sorry, Ian. Uh, and I think he himself is probably one of the best people who writes about the taste of the city. But I'd love any of your thoughts about books that are brilliant about the taste of the city. So moving on to other ailments that he mentioned, the one that he really was most interested in was the idea of dying well. Um, and we did have a bit of a discussion about it before we actually met because it's obviously a preoccupation. He's 75. He said that many novelists in their latter years start to think about death, understandably. And we were therefore having a bit of a shared chat about books that tackle the idea of dying well. And he told me about this book, The Hummingbird by Sandro Veronese, which he recommended to me as a brilliant book, which does have a really excellent death at the end of it, which I don't want to tell you about in detail because I don't want to spoil it for you. But I'd really urge you to read it. It's a first novel, debut novel, and it is very much endorsed by Ian McEwan, possibly even on the back. And it's told in a slightly unusual way. It's told from many different voices. You could call it an epistolary novel because it does have some letters. It also has text messages and some transcribed phone conversations, and some of it is written a bit like lists as well. But it's a really enjoyable read. It's not as kind of intensely list like as Georges Perec, for instance, in Life a User's Manual. It does actually have an ongoing trajectory of a tale. It's about this man, Marco, who is the hummingbird. He's called the hummingbird because initially because he's very short, but then because he um, spends his whole life flapping his wings and staying still, so to speak. And he has some fairly major tragedies in his life. He loses his sister, loses his daughter, and he loses his parents all quite early on. But he also has a love of his life who he loves throughout his whole life unrequitedly. And I'm just going to read you a little section of the book to give you a little flavour of it. But it is interesting because it does actually dot from voice to voice throughout the whole novel in a really interesting way. So this is the chapter's called Sadly, 1981, and it's a letter to Louisa Lattes, who's the woman that he loves throughout his life in Florence, and it's written on the 11th of September 1981. Louisa, my Louisa. No, not mine, sadly, just Louisa. Louisa, 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 Louisa. I ran away, you say. It's true. But after what happened, for those long, unimaginable days, I was racked with guilt and I wasn't myself anymore. I was no one. I went into some kind of a trance. I thought it was all my fault because I was with you when it happened, because I was happy with you. I still think it is my fault. Now they're saying it was God's will or destiny and all that bullshit. And Giacomo and I were at each other's throats. And I blamed him, and I can't even look my parents in the face. If I ran away, my Louisa, no, not mine, sadly, just Louisa, 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 Louisa. I ran in the wrong direction, like those pheasants I saw in the forest fire once, back when I was a fireman. Terrified of the blaze, they leapt up, and instead of flying away from it, they flailed towards the flames, getting closer, too close, until they fell in. The fact is, I didn't realise I'd run away. There were so many things to take care of, all of them terrifying, and there was that ridiculous Montagues and Capulets fast that made it impossible for me to venture past the hedge. Of course, it was possible, Louisa. I'm not denying it. Louisa, 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 Louisa. But I was beside myself, Louisa, and so I didn't, and didn't even say goodbye. And now I'm here alone, and I mean truly alone. Everyone has left. They say they'll never come back, sell the house, never set foot on a beach again, never go on holiday again. And you all left too. And I venture past the hedge all the time now, and no one can see me. And I go to the beach to Mullinelly behind the dunes, and there's no one there. And I should be studying, but I'm not even pretending. And I think of you. I think of Irene, of the happiness and the desperation that crashed down on me at the same time and in the same place. And I don't want to lose either of them. Yet, I want them both. And I'm afraid I'll lose them too. Lose this pain, lose this happiness, lose you, Louisa, like I lost my sister. And maybe I've lost you already because you say I've run away. And sadly, that's true. I've run away, but not from you. I've only run away in the wrong direction, like those pheasants. Louisa, 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 Louisa. I'm begging you. We've only just begun. Don't you die too. And even if I've run away, wait for me, forgive me, hold me, kiss me. I haven't run out of things to say. I've run out of paper. So that is The Hummingbird, which was recommended to me by Ian McEwan. And I can very much agree that it's a brilliant book. And it does have a really great death. So Ian McEwan asked for books with with scenes in which characters die well. And so I had 3 or 4 prescriptions for him. One was Benediction by Kent Haruf, who is a fantastic writer. If you haven't read him, you must. He also wrote Our Souls at Night, which is a really fabulous book about an older couple falling in love in their 70s and spending nights together and being disapproved of by their children. Then Benediction it's the third in a trilogy of books that he wrote. It's about Dad Lewis, who's dying of pancreatic cancer. He refuses to take medication, but is putting his affairs in order. And it's actually a very celebratory end of life story. Tinkers by Paul Harding, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2010. That's about a man who lies dying in bed and debris is falling on him as he dreams of his father and his childhood in Maine, where he had a very idyllic childhood surrounded by nature. Nature and poverty making him feel connected with generations past and future. So, Tinkers by Paul Harding, it's a bit of a stream of consciousness style book, but it is very beautiful and very inspiring and very much making you feel connected with people both from the past and from the future. A bit like I feel The Overstory by Richard Powers, which is another fantastic book. And that's one which, through nature, makes you feel connected with the past and the present because it's talking about the giant redwood trees, which are 200 or 300 years old, and their slow life makes you as a human feel less small in a strange way. Then also Gilead by Marilyn Robinson. She's another Pulitzer Prize winner. And also Home by her, which is about the Reverend John Ames as he lies dying, and he's writing letters to his young son. So he's in his 80s. He was a preacher, and his young son is 5, and he's putting all his wisdom into his letters before he dies. And that's another really beautiful and amazingly well written story. I think Gilead is a book that's quite long. It doesn't have a lot of drama, but it's just got a lot of beauty and wisdom in it. And then I also recommended to Ian McEwan one of my favourite books that I've definitely talked about on these sessions before, which is Some 40 Tales from the Afterlives by David Eagleman, which is a book of short stories, which I encouraged Ian McEwan to read aloud with his wife because they're very funny. They are surprising. And although they're nominally about the afterlife, they're actually about living your life well. And they are really brilliant stories. So those were my prescriptions to the author, Ian McEwan, and hopefully he might report back to me one of these days on what he thought about them. So I think that could be it for tonight. Having rounded up my session with the amazing, great novelist Ian McEwan, who's written 17 novels. This is 17th, all of which are very different and all of which I admire and love in different ways. Machines Like Me, for instance, that's a great one about a computer that is a kind of android human who becomes a companion to a couple. Really interesting. The Children Act, which is a really fantastic, interesting story about a boy who needs a blood transfusion and his parents are Jehovah's Witnesses, so he's not allowed to have it. And it's about the judge who gets involved in the story. Black Dogs, really interesting early novel by him. Chesil Beach, I was talking about earlier. Enduring Love, one of my favourites ever. And lots more that I don't have to hand. Also, not to mention Saturday, which is one of my favourites, which I recommend often, particularly because it's really great on long-term love and love in marriages. And I am finding it quite hilarious that it's got this sperm going across the cover. If only I'd taken that one to get Ian to sign it, would have been rather great. Anyway, thanks so much for joining me this evening. Do check out my website and Instagram. I'm doing a special bibliotherapy offer for Valentine's Day where you can buy a bibliotherapy session. No, I'm just trying to remember how much it is. You're going to have a look because it's a discount, but I can't remember exactly what I said. So you can buy a bibliotherapy session for a loved one, or you can buy a bibliotherapy session for you as a couple or for a couple that you love. Um, and that's a really lovely thing to do as well. So check out that idea. Bibliotherapy as a Valentine's gift is a pretty fantastic concept because you're giving the gift of books, but in a long-term way. Because in a session with me, I prescribe 6 books, and I get to know the person over the course of an hour, find out what they love to read, what they don't love to read, what's going on in their lives, and then I prescribe them the perfect books for them to read right now. What's not to love? So check that out. Website, Instagram, Valentine's Day, Bibliotherapy. Thanks so much for joining me this evening and see you next week. Good night.